All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Mid-Atlantic Tech Bridge Tech Talk, where we have Mr. Paul Hawkins here to talk to us about joint ventures and maximizing your win strategy. So I asked that you keep yourself on mute. You can keep your camera off. If you have questions throughout his presentation, you can put them into chat and we'll save time at the end for Q&A. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Julie Stark to introduce the Tech Bridge.
Okay, well, hi, everyone. Hello to the folks in the room and everybody online. Thank you for joining us. So I'm here with one of the three directors for the Mid-Atlantic Tech Bridge. I'm Julie Stark. I'm here with my colleague Joanne Pilcher, who's from Dynamic Activity. Dahlgren is here, and our colleague Gerald Walker is covering other meetings. So our job as a Tech Bridge is to find collaborative opportunities between the Department of the Navy and non-traditional partners. So small businesses and academic institutions, nonprofits, and we do sometimes have collaborations and engagements with bigger industry partners as well, but we're kind of looking for those hidden gems where we can get technology into the warfighters' hands faster and smarter and cheaper. So to that end, we partner with different organizations like the nonprofit organization that's hosting us here today, 757 CoLab. And 757 CoLab helps us to run events that are of interest to our different engagement partners and people interested in doing work with the Department of the Navy. So today is one of the talks that we are hosting where he we'll be talking here in a few minutes, and then we'll have time for engagement afterwards. If you like to reach out and connect with the Mid-Atlantic Tech Bridge or the rest of the Tech Bridge network, which consists of 18 tech bridges throughout the world, including a couple overseas. Please, you can just reach out to the MATB. The best way to do it is through LinkedIn or through our website, and we can make connections in other ways. And I think that's all I have. Joanne, do you have anything to add?
No, thank you.
Oh, great. Okay, take it.
All right, thank you, Julie. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Joe D'Amelio with 757 CoLab to talk just a little bit about what they do as our PIA partner.
Thanks, Tina. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe D'Amelio. I'm the program manager for 757 Accelerate, and 757 CoLab is the PIA partner for the Mid-Atlantic Tech Bridge, helping to bring non-traditional startups and solutions to the Navy and the government. So 757 CoLab is comprised of 4 verticals, as you can see on the screen. The first one being the 757 Startup Studios, which is an incubator program where applicants who are accepted to the program get 6 months of co-working space, incubation, customized programming, and access to our vast mentor network to help them take their ideation phase business into the next level and hopefully get them ready to go on to bigger and better things. The next vertical we have, as you can see on the screen, is the 757 Accelerate. It's a 10-week program targeting much more advanced companies who are looking to grow rapidly and or exit. At the end of that 10-week program, we take the startups on an investor roadshow to 4 different cities, and each participant or each startup gets $20,000 of non-dilutive equity for attending and completing our program as well. The third vertical is the 757 Angels Group. They have 3 rounds per year where they accept applications from all over the country, although they are focused in investing in Virginia-based companies. They are one of the top 3 angel groups in the company, and to date have $105 million invested. And the last vertical you see on the screen is the 757 Partnerships, and that's where we do customized programming for community partners and other organizations. We've done work with Rise Resilience, the LISC Group, as well as the Hampton Roads Biomedical Research Corporation, and anybody else who's looking to have programming designed for their needs. Thank you, Tina.
Thanks, Joe. All right, Paul, over to you.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Paul Hawkins. Here in the room, I'm in front of the folks in the room, but hopefully everybody can hear me out there that's dialed in. And yeah, today, very happy to work with the Mid-Atlantic Tech Bridge folks. I've known Tina for quite a while in different organizations through Task and others locally here, and so really excited to be able to join you all today for the Tech Talk. And today we're talking about joint venturing. So I know that's a topic of interest to a lot of small business government contractors. It's a topic that we help a lot of clients on and that we speak about pretty frequently. Again, my name is Paul Hawkins. I'm a government contracts attorney with Reaves GovCon Group. We're a local firm. We're based out of Chesapeake. And you may have come across myself or my partner, Brad Reaves. He founded the firm about 12 years ago. And so we really focus on helping small business government contractors primarily across a lot of issues. So, but yeah, this is a topic we speak on frequently. And so we'll kind of get going here. Next slide, please. That's just if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, that's just a QR code you can use. You can do that. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect with you there and hopefully go further on any questions you might have or anything to follow up. All right, just an overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit about joint venturing fundamentals, sort of what is it, sort of what are the kind of common issues, how is it differentiating from a teaming agreement under the FAR, things like that. We're going to, quickly just sort of talk about how the Mentor Protégé program, the SBA's Mentor Protégé program ties into it, how they're different, but they're related and necessary kind of partners to a degree. We'll talk a little bit about the JV certification and review requirements. There really aren't many requirements on that front anymore, but some of the administrative things you have to do when you put these together to make sure you're properly reflecting in all the government databases when you're trying to bid on contracts and things like that. We'll talk about the joint venture program specifics. There's a lot of very specific rules that the SBA has put into place for joint ventures to be eligible to bid on small business set-asides, service-disabled veteran-owned small business, women-owned small business, 8A contracts, things like that. So we'll talk through some of those, kind of run down of the rules. And then we'll end it with just a few kind of recent decisions from the SBA's Office of Hearings and Appeals that have kind of developed some of the law, if you will, on how the SBA reviews these JV agreements for compliance. And I guess for questions, if folks want to chat over questions, and we're happy to address those kind of as we go, and then towards the end as well, there should be definitely a few minutes left open for questions at the end, and I'll do my best to answer them as best I can. I told Tina when I walked in here before too, I am fighting off hopefully a little bit on the upswing of a pretty bad summer cold. So I forgive my voice, forgive maybe the coughing as you may hear, but we'll all do the best we can. I want to give a quick disclaimer here. So we're lawyers, we have to do this. This presentation is just for informational purposes only. I can't really get into really specific legal questions you may have on the call today and give really specific advice. And none of this is really meant to be specific legal advice. But we always say this, if you're a government contractor, it would behoove you to reach out and sort of work with an attorney that specializes in this area, because it's a very highly specialized regulatory area with a lot of regulatory controls on it. So we'd love for that to be us, but there's a lot of really good government contracting attorneys specific to the Hampton Roads area as well. So just I would say definitely reach out to one of those. All right. To kind of get started here, I think a slide I wanted to show up there. I was telling Tina that my partner Brad and I recently spoke at a national conference in May, the National Veteran Small Business Coalition. We had a training session on this very topic. And I wanted to put this slide up here to show sort of how joint venturing has become a very kind of key strategy for small business government contractors. So in a recent, I believe this is a VA contracting vehicle, but a recent one, so T4 NG2, which some of you all may be familiar with that contracting vehicle. These are some of the stats that we actually gleaned from the NVSBC. That if you look at there for T4NG2 in 2024, the number of JV awards were 20 JV awards out of the total awards, which was 100% of the SDVOSB awards were to JVs. So why is that, you may ask? Well, a lot of these government-wide acquisition contracts or GWACs or these larger IDIQ, if you hear the term like best in class, these IDIQ type vehicles, a lot of them have these scoring mechanisms in the solicitation. And it is becoming kind of difficult to meet those scoring thresholds without combining the capabilities, the past performance, the business certifications, things like that, that you would get from a JV partner or partners, or even more importantly, possibly a large business mentor that you're in an SBA approved all small mentor protege agreement with. And so what we're seeing a lot of is that, the joint venture went from this thing the SBA rules allow, but because there was a little bit less guidance around it, maybe less familiarity from contracting officers before, we see some kind of issues. But now I think it's become a lot more common, and now it's kind of morphing into almost something that it has to be kind of part of your strategy to go out and bid on contracts. Next slide, please. Yeah.
So just, can you go back one, please?
Yeah.
So, a lot of this terminology is new to me. I've worked for the government for a long time and I'm a scientist, not a lawyer.
Oh, yeah, sure.
What's the difference, or if it makes sense, like the T4, T4NG, like, what do those mean? Just real brief.
Oh, yeah, no, of course. Good question. I'll be honest with you. I don't know what T4NG stands for.
Okay, well,
Actually,
it's
but I'll tell you what it is. Yeah.
it's a VA.
Yeah.
Large IDIQ that they bring in a lot of their work through.
Yeah. So if you've heard of,
T4 is a large IDIQ.
It's just the name of the contract.
well, so it's just the name of the contract. So if you've heard of Seaport Next Gen, A-Day Stars 3, soup, NASA soup. I mean, yeah, go ahead.
Those are all tanks, the ones you're describing.
I'm sorry.
No, that's like an example of what this is for the VA.
Yeah. So this is just one particular example. Yeah. That this is a best in class multiple award contract vehicle that the VA uses. And so I just use this as an example to show kind of how over time in the previous iterations of the contract, how JVs have become more common as far as awardees in order to meet the threshold requirements.
Okay.
There's a lot of other, OASIS is another, other GSA government-wide contracting vehicles would be, other examples where people are using the joint venture vehicle to bid on those wider vehicles, if that makes sense. No, good question. And I don't want to make sure, definitely want to make sure everybody understands all the terminology and everything. So
it was Transformation 21 Total Technology Next Generation.
Nice.
Is the name of the contract.
Very T4, got it. Okay, yeah. I was about to say, I'll be honest with you, I don't know what that acronym stands for, but
Mouthful.
yeah, it is a mouthful. All right, yeah. Okay, so yeah, I mean, so that kind of I think is a good scene setter to understand kind of why this topic is very relevant to small business government contractors. So just stepping all the way back to a refresher, just what is a joint venture? As folks may or may not already be aware, so under FAR Part 9, the FAR speaks to two types of quote teaming arrangements that bidders can use to bid on contracts with the government. It speaks to teaming agreements and then joint ventures. So what's the difference between those? What are at a high level? A teaming agreement, which we're not going into today necessarily, but just to sort of say at a high level, a teaming agreement is just simply a contract that two parties will sign as they pursue a contract, and they essentially agree for one party to prime the effort, the other party is going to be a subcontractor. They usually differentiate work share in that teaming agreement. They hatch out things like what happens if we decide to protest, who's going to own the intellectual property we develop in this proposal effort, how are we going to divvy out the proposal effort, issues, things like that. So teaming agreements will cover all of those things. And again, so the result is, you go in together where you lock in that potential subcontractor that's going to be part of your team. You bid for that contract on the government, and then post award, that prime contractor will award a subcontract to the prospective the teammate subcontractor. So that's what a teaming agreement is. It's just essentially a contract that you sign before you bid on new work like that. A joint venture is a little more in depth. So a joint venture is actually more of a formal legal arrangement that you enter into with another entity or multiple entities. And you actually form a separate legal entity. You form a separate limited liability company most of the time. That separate limited liability company is going to have its own UEI and cage code. It's going to be registered in SAM, separate from the parties. And that's going to actually be the legal entity that contracts with the government. So if you want to think of it, you're almost like co-primes under that joint venture umbrella, as opposed to the prime sub relationship that you're going to form with a teaming agreement. There's also different enforcement rights between joint venture partners. You're sharing more in the overall profits and losses. We'll kind of talk about it here in a second. So there are some differences there, whereas their teaming agreement, it's just a contract that says, hey, look, we're going to build this thing together, and after we get the award, I'll issue you a subcontract after the award, right? There's some more things to go into with teaming agreements. Not to get too sidetracked on there. Some folks may have heard that, hey, I've heard teaming agreements aren't enforceable. Well, that's kind of partly correct, especially under Virginia law. Teaming agreements are very hard to enforce if you have to go all the way to court and actually sue a prime for not giving you the subcontract they promised to give you. Courts have been kind of hesitant to fully enforce teaming agreements as contracts. And so there's kind of, that's this whole separate topic for another day maybe, but that's the two types of teaming arrangements that the FAR speaks to. Next slide. So I kind of talked about this earlier. A JV entity is typically formed as a separate legal entity, and that's the offerer, that's the bidder to the government. One thing I guess to think about there is that is a timing thing. So for teaming agreements can be relatively easy to put together. It's as simple as drawing up a quick contract and having the parties sign to it, and then putting up, and then getting the proposal together and the pricing to submit a bid. Whereas a joint venture, because you are going to be forming a separate legal entity, you're going to have to get that its own cage code. You're going to have to register it in SAM. You typically can't turn those things around, in a matter of just days. Getting an entity set up through the Virginia State Corporation Commission is pretty easy, but you may run into a little lag trying to get a cage code or something like that. And so, JVs, in other words, if you got a bid due in a week or something, it's going to be difficult, now impossible, to set up a whole JV to go after that bid. So that's something to think about there.
No, it's impossible.
Yeah, basically impossible.
SAM and get a new Duns cage.
Right. And I think it's now
Nowadays.
the government folks can maybe kind of help me here, but I think it's really the cage code that's like the long pole in the tent, right? That can.
You can verify that you're eligible to receive money from the US government and all that. So the SAM account's instant.
Yeah.
Cage code takes, I think they sell you a minimum of like 21 days or something.
Right. Yeah. So that's good. Yeah. So it's so that part is going to be hard. I will say this, that joint ventures can be set up as what we call like agreement-based joint ventures, meaning you don't form a separate legal entity. In other words, you don't form a separate limited liability company with the state and register it. And in fact, in a lot of commercial settings, like if I'm a construction company and I'm in a joint venture with another construction company to build, some high rise here in downtown Norfolk or something, I wouldn't say that particular complex incident, but theoretically, a lot of times those are just a pretty, big contract on steroids, right? That forms an agreement-based joint venture that's almost more like a informal partnership. You can technically do that, as government joint ventures, but you still actually have to register that separately in SAM. You still have to actually get it its own UEI, because the government's going to contract with that entity, if you will, that separate legal kind of entity. And so, so again, 99.9% of the time we set these up as separate LLCs, and it's just easier that way. All right, next slide, please. We talked a little bit about that, about the, you know, unincorporated versus, you know, unincorporated JVs. You have to have a JV agreement in writing. So there's two kind of separate things. You form the LLC with the Virginia State Corporation Commission, you get articles of organization, things like that. But you actually have to have a separate in writing joint venture agreement that, you know, we can, the way we typically do these, we'd write them up as a consolidated joint venture agreement and an operating agreement of the entity, because as folks may know, with an LLC, LLCs are governed by an operating agreement. So we consolidate those two kind of concepts into the same document. But regardless, it must be, agreement must be in writing. And as I understand it too, sometimes with proposals, sometimes the solicitation will actually have you submit some of that documentation with your proposal, whether it's a copy of the teaming agreement or a copy of the joint venture agreement. And we'll get this into a little bit later, but all these things need to be in place before you submit your bid on whatever contract you're going to be bidding on for the first time with the joint venture, especially if it's a set aside contract. Excuse me. All right, next slide, please. So one thing, you know, kind of getting into a little bit of the benefits of joint ventures and some of the differences. So typically a teaming agreement is set up for a kind of a one-off thing. You know, you're teaming together for a certain contract. Maybe you're teaming together for an IDIQ contract, and that teaming agreement may speak to how you handle task orders or something. But typically teaming agreements are not set up to be kind of longer term entities. JVs, on the other hand, while they're set up to be kind of limited purpose, they can cover multiple RFPs and contracts. So there are rules about affiliation and things like that we'll talk about in a little bit. But a JV can be set up and it can then bid on multiple contracts within certain some of the certain size rule constraints, which that's something that's a little bit different. We talked a little about how, you know, the JV agreement is going to handle management, control, work share, how you distribute profits and losses within the JV. All of that is something that is handled, you know, within the JV agreement. And, you know, from the government's perspective, as we, you know, it would seem, you know, and I think the government, at least some corners of the government think this, you know, there's kind of the benefit of getting kind of co-primes, if you will. So in other words, you have, instead of just having one entity that you're directly reaching out to, you have actually multiple entities now. And oh, by the way, if one of those entities fails, you know, the other one is going to step in and still be responsible for contract performance. So you get some added, in the government, at least get some added security there. And then this is kind of crucial too. One of the things about joint ventures as well is that it actually can be for companies that are you know, leverages their ability to bid on small business, SDVOSB, woman-owned 8A, et cetera, set aside contracts. For companies that are starting to grow and starting to butt up against their size standard, JVs can actually be a good strategy for kind of managing that growth and extending that ramp a little bit. And this is why. If you're a prime, so if you team with somebody and you're going to be a prime contractor, let's say, just for ease of numbers here, the contract's for $1 million. Even if you're going to sub out $500,000 of that contract, all $1 million of that contract falls to your bottom line for your revenue calculation. If you're in a joint venture and you're doing, let's say, 40% of that $1 million, and you're only doing $400,000 of the work, only $400,000 of that is going to fall to your revenue calculation. So it's actually a way where, again, if you're kind of butting up against your size standard and you need to start managing that, because maybe you need, as part of your business strategy, you need to have more access, more ramp to those set aside contracts for a few more years or something. Joint ventures are a good way to manage that. Excuse me. So we kind of already talked about this a little bit. You know, there's a sharing of profits and losses with the joint venture. That can be seen kind of as a drawback. I mean, you subcontract, there's more of a, you know, you're not as tied with that subcontractor, obviously. There are, again, more costs in getting the JV set up. You know, you obviously have legal fees to set up and maintain the JV. You got to get a separate business license or separate tax filings. You may have to, you know, pay a separate an accountant or bookkeeper to keep the JV books separately. There's things like that. I mentioned their facility security clearance issues. That's also been a kind of traditional headache for joint ventures. The recent SBA rules have sought to clarify that a little more. One of the things, you know, we'll mention this on a future slide. So for a few reasons. One, SBA joint ventures, so joint ventures that are set up to comply with the SBA programs, they have to be unpopulated, meaning the joint venture entity does not have its own employees. All the employees that are performing the contract are the employees of the parties to the joint venture. So how would that run? How would you run into an issue then with a facility security clearance? Who's the FSO for the joint venture if the joint venture doesn't have any employees? Right. So a facility security clearance requires you to have a facility security officer. So what the SBA has said is, one, JVs for that limited purpose can designate a facility security officer if the JV is going to you know, apply for its own FCL. The other thing that had been a problem before too is the process for getting a facility security clearance can be kind of lengthy, and it requires, to say, right, I get a laugh in there, I mean, to say the least, right? It can be kind of lengthy, and it requires, you know, you to have basically like a sponsoring entity, right? Like, in other words, you need to be on a contract in order to get sponsored to get that clearance. So what happens though, if the parties themselves already have FCLs, they're already experienced contractors dealing with classified contracts, so they form a joint venture, isn't it kind of backwards to then make them wait because to get the JV cleared? Well, the SBA has said now, and there's been some memos put out by DOD that kind of marries this up, that yes, you know, the JV parties FCLs can now kind of be imputed to the JV as long as, as long as it kind of meets the requirements of the solicitation. So in other words, let's say one party to the JV has the facility security clearance and the other one doesn't. As long as that party that has it is going to be performing the majority of the work that involves that classified work, then yeah, they would be able to still be eligible at that point. So there's been a lot more flexibility and questions answered on that area, but that was kind of a less clear area for a long time. One of the other JV drawbacks, and this is again, you can get really into weeds on this stuff here pretty quickly, but sometimes the accounting and how you deal with what are costs, how do we determine what are overall profits and losses. You'll see in a little bit that the SBA rules require the profits and losses of the JV to be split a certain way. How do we define that? There's not a lot of guidance there. So therefore, how do we price things? And all that? That can sometimes, it's just a problem to work through. It's not a big deal, but it can get complicated. All right, next slide. All right, so kind of getting a little bit into some of the fundamentals here of JVs. So one thing to keep in mind, again, because I assume most of the folks on the call, that are going to listen to this are probably small business government contractors if they're on the contractor side. One thing to, one big kind of takeaway, if you're less familiar with this topic or less familiar dealing with this in your business experience, the one thing to keep in mind, foot stomper, is a large business cannot joint venture with a small business and that joint venture qualify for a set aside contract. Can't do it. The only way you can do that is if that large business and that small business are in an an already SBA approved mentor protege agreement that permits joint venturing, right? Yes.
You say SBA approved, but like there's a Navy SBA and there's a other SBA. What does it mean SBA approved?
SBA, so by SBA approved, I mean it's been you've applied through the SBAs, the Small Business Administration's All Small Mentor Protege Program office through. So it's an SBA, set right. It's not done through an agency.
So that means agency specific mentor proteges may not meet that requirement.
That's right. So as far as I'm aware, the SBA's government-wide all small mentor protege program, and we got a slide on that, I think maybe next, is the only program that permits joint venturing. So for example, the DoD program, which is a great program, and it has a lot of good features. It has a couple of features the SBA program doesn't, but it doesn't allow for joint venturing, right? So, but the SBA program does. And in that instance, it's the only time where a large business, so a Booz Allen Hamilton, a Lockheed Martin or whatever, if they're in a mentor protege agreement with, you know, your small business partner, they joint venture together, they can bid on a set aside contract.
So follow-up question is,
Yeah.
that creates confusion because multiple MP programs, different rules, you gotta pay close attention.
Yeah.
Is that likely heading in the direction that the SBA, small business, women-owned, SDB, OSB, is all ultimately falling under SBA for the same set of rules on getting those certifications, i.e. in the MP world, maybe they all fall under SBA ultimately, so everybody follows the same rules?
I don't see that if your question is, if the question,
You don't see it happening?
yeah, I was gonna say, if the question is, you know, will like the specific department or agency mentor protege programs kind of go away in favor of I don't see that. And the reason is because there's reasons why they have those department specific programs. And like, for example, the DoD program, part of, you know, a feature of the DoD program is that it provides for if a large business has a protege company under the DoD program, they can do like preferential subcontracting and then other similar business development assistance things that you can do under the SBA program. Excuse me. They can do that. And then one of the nice features of the DoD program is that large business mentor can also get some cost reimbursement for that assistance under the DoD program. And there's some specific reasons why the DoD has that stuff. So I don't see that going away. But I mean, to Kip's question, and I think it's important to understand, the SBA's program, the SBA's All Small Mentor Protege program, is a government-wide program. So you apply for it through the SBA, you sign a mentor protege agreement that outlines all the different areas of assistance to possibly include joint venturing. If you want to joint venture, you need to put that in the mentor protege agreement, that's one of the areas of assistance you're going to be doing. Once the SBA approves that, you can then do the joint venture and then start going after work together as part of that assistance. And again, that's government wide. So you can bid as a mentor protege JV for DoD work, for VA work, for Homeland Security work. I mean, it's a government wide program. Yes.
So if there's a joint venture between an SBA approved mentor and protege, does it then dictate that the mentoring company has to perform a certain percentage of the work?
Yes, and I will get to that here in a second. So that's a very good question. So yes, there are very specified rules on how the joint venture is to be set up if the joint venture is going to be bidding on set aside work, and that's to include a mentor protege joint venture. And so yeah, hold that thought. I'll get to that in just a couple of slides. So good question. Okay, so that's kind of the situation if there's a large business wanting to joint venture with a small business, right? What if two or more small businesses want to joint venture together? So the SBA specifically allows, on the one hand, if it's a generic small business set aside, so not a socioeconomic, it's not a hub zone contract, it's not a women-owned contract. If it's just a generic small business set aside, two or more small businesses can joint venture together and bid on that contract together as a joint venture. And the joint venture agreement in that specific instance, the joint venture agreement doesn't have to say doesn't have to have any certain requirements in it. The work share doesn't have to be in a certain way. They can split that work share however they want under the requirements. So as long as, again, it's a generic small business set aside and it's all small businesses joint venturing together. Now, if it is some other kind of socioeconomic set aside, so it's an SDVOSB contract, a hub zone contract, a women-owned contract, an 8A contract. In that instance, the managing venturer of the joint venture must have that designation that corresponds to the contract. and they have to partner either with another small business or their SBA approved mentor, right? And the joint venture agreement has to specify and comply with certain SBA rules for the JV to be eligible for that.
But it doesn't have to be like if it was a WSB managing partner and they want to go WSB, it doesn't have to be with another WSB.
Correct. It can be with another small business. It can be with that WSB's mentor,
Yeah, okay.
right? But it doesn't have to be with another WSB. But again, but that other partner, if they're not a WSB, they still have to be small under that NAICS code, or the SBA approved mentor. Yeah. All right, and then we'll talk about that a little bit later about what those requirements are. Okay, so we already talked about the mentor protege program and answered some questions on that. So just try to maybe hit a couple of high points here. Again, I think the big takeaway here is, because we get this question a lot, even for folks that are somewhat familiar with this, is the mentor protege agreement is a separate document from the joint venture agreement. They're two different things. So a mentor protege agreement is going to read, it is a contract. It's going to read like a contract, and it's going to have in there the meat of that agreement is going to say, I, the mentor, agreed to provide you, protege, the following areas of business development assistance. And that can include management and technical assistance. It can include administrative assistance. It can even include financial assistance, so that mentor can provide loans, lines of credit. Mentor can take up to 40% equity in the protege is another feature of the program. So there's and then of course, obviously relevant to today, it can include contracting assistance to include that ability to joint venture with the partner. That all has to be, if you're going to do the mentor protege, you have to set all that up first and get the SBA to approve it before you then set up the joint venture with the mentor to go after work. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah. So a lot of times people will kind of conflate the two or kind of not understand that the one has to come before the other if you're going to bid with that later. All right, next slide. Okay. This kind of gets at the first slide we talked about, but one kind of vital advantage to joint ventures, and again, it speaks to this evolution in the rules, I think, to support joint ventures, is that the SBA rules specifically say now that contracting officers must, note this language, must and shall, right? When evaluating capabilities, past performance, experience, business systems, certifications of a small business joint venture, the activity must consider work done and qualifications held individually by each partner to the joint venture, as well as any work done by the JV itself. So the obvious problem they had to solve was, okay, you just formed a joint venture. That JV, that entity, has no past performance. You formed it 2 weeks ago. But it makes no sense to not give credit to the partners that are going to be actually performing the work. So this is saying, hey, you have to give credit to both the partner's past performance and the JV itself past performance. Because after that JV maybe performs a contract or two, now it has past performance, right? But not only that, you can't require the protege firm to individually meet the same evaluation criteria in that. So in other words, it's trying to really, bring home the benefits of the mentor protege program, especially in saying that you need to actually, need to allow for that benefit of what the mentor brings. So you have to, maybe they're the ones who bring the cost accounting system, the approved cost accounting system or something. So you need to evaluate it on that basis. So these rules have been kind of more coming into place the last couple of years. And there's been some GAO bid protest case law on this very close, because sometimes solicitations will read a certain way that seems to violate this rule, because they're trying to tease out how to hold that protege company or that small business company's feet to the fire to say, okay, but what do you bring to the table, right? More than just your 8A status or your woman-owned status. So how do you do that while complying with this rule? So there's been some GAO case law on this recently. Bottom line is on that, the government can require somewhat of saying, look, you need to meet some kind of minimum requirements. Maybe you need to have at least one past performance reference in the patent that you submit or something like that. So anyway, that's, that's gets kind of complicated, but bottom line is just keep this rule in mind. And this is what, is a big advantage of joint ventures. Okay, so a lot of folks for in this topic may have heard of the 3 and 2 rule, the 3 awards in 2 years rule. So the SBA did away with that a few years ago. So now the way the joint ventures work for the SBA is that a JV can get as many contract awards as possible, really, within a 2-year period after the date of the first award. So in other words, there's not they dropped the 3 award limit rule. So in other words, this is how it works. You set up your joint venture to go after SBA set aside work. Starting on the date the JV gets the first award, you can then bid on contracts, as many contracts as you want, for a 2-year period after that. And after that 2-year period, you can't bid on any more contracts with that joint venture. Otherwise, you'll be found to be affiliated after that point. But the JV can get as many contract awards as it can within that constraint. So in other words, think about it this way. Let's say we get a contract award July 15th of 2024. So now our clock started then, so we can bid with that JV until July 15th of 2026. Let's say we submit a bid on July 14th, 2026. That was okay. And we can even get the contract on December 1st, 2026, as long as, it was in that scenario I just described, right? So you can bid with the JV for a 2-year period after the first award. There's no more 3 contract limits, if you will, under the SBA's rules. And the reason for that is the SBA, they don't want these JVs to be stood up and last for 10, 15 years. They want them to be limited purpose entities. But it's a little bit of a farce, if you ask me, because what can you do after that 2-year point? You set up a new joint venture with the same partner. You just call it JV2, LLC, right? Now, where you have to be careful with that is the SBA affiliation rules do say if you keep joint venturing with the same company over and over again, at some point there could be a finding of affiliation with that company. So, 2 is fine, 3 is probably okay. After 3, we're starting to question whether you're probably going to get size protested if you try to bid with.
That kind of assumes the government agencies are actually communicating with each other.
And it assumes you have savvy competitors who pick up on the fact too that, hey, this is probably the 3rd or 4th JV these companies have set up, and so they file a size protest. Yeah, is how it would come up as well. Okay, so next slide. I know we're actually kind of running a little time here, but I think these last few slides will kind of push through them. Okay, so yeah, this is another important kind of recent, more recent changes to the rules too. So the only time actually now where the SBA requires you to submit your joint venture agreement itself to the SBA for like a prior approval, even if all that is just to kind of check a box in a system somewhere, is in the instance of an 8A sole source award. So back in the day, 8A joint ventures had to get approved by the SBA. They don't anymore. So the only time that actually happens is if your 8A joint venture is going to do a sole source, then the SBA has to pre-approve it before you get that award from the agency. Otherwise, the way this is policed is you set up the joint venture, you set up the agreement compliant with the rules, and the JV is subject to like with any set aside contract, the JV is subject to a size protest or a status protest, right, by a competitor. And that's where the SBA would then review your joint venture agreement to ensure it complies with the rules. And if it doesn't, you'd be found ineligible for the award, and that would be a bad day, obviously. So there were prior requirements that SDVOSB and VOSB joint ventures had to get separately certified when that program was run by the VA. So that's not the case anymore. As a lot of folks probably know, the SBA now runs the government-wide SDVOSB and VOSB certification program. So now all that's required is that the socioeconomic partner, so the hub zone company, the the SDVOSB company, they have their certification is what matters. Now, with that said, be mindful that there may be other kind of administrative requirements you need to be aware of for those specific programs so that when you register that, let's say, woman-owned small business joint venture, when you register it, that how do I say it? There may be boxes you have to go check in the SBA certified portal so that when that contracting officer looks it up in the SBA's database, they see that check is next to it, that it's a woman-owned small business joint venture. And also be careful how you fill those reps and certs out in SAM. We're actually literally dealing with an issue right now where SAM can be a little funky in how you check the boxes for what your designation is, and that that may trip you up, and you may be not representing the right way in SAM, and that kind of may cause confusion. So despite the fact that there's not these formal requirements to have the JV certified beforehand, there probably are some administrative issues you have to go through when you're registering it.
And if as a company, you find that it was something you initially or update, you have to edit that, update it, wait for it to take place in SAM. It may or may not automatically populate to different agencies. So you have to individually go to the agencies and make sure they have your updated information, especially if that means your DUNS or cage changed, which sometimes it does. When you update something in SAM, sometimes you get a new cage. Sorry, that's something a lot of people mess up on.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's a good point. And I would say a public service announcement on that front. All right, there we go. No, it's all good. And I think a public service announcement on that front, totally separate topic, but there's been a lot of protests recently where companies have their SAM registration will lapse during award pendency. And there have been protests where the rules on that are pretty harsh. If your SAM registration lapses, you're done. And there have been, and so companies have picked up on those protest decisions, and there's been like more protests on that. People are watching that SAM like a hawk, and if the awardee, they go back and look at their SAM history and they're like, oh, looks like they were inactive for a few days there. That's a protest ground. So be mindful of those, of SAM and those other databases you have to monitor. Next slide. All right, so these are just some of the roles. These are the different areas of the roles for the different SBA programs. I'll mention this because we don't normally speak on this, but I'll add this up there too, just for this audience. You can bid or not bid. You can propose for a SBIR funding agreement as a joint venture. So that's actually in the SBIR size and affiliation roles, is that you can form a joint venture to go after SBIR funding agreements. I won't speak more to that of like why you would want to do that, how you would want to split that work. I mean, I think there probably are some work requirements within that, but for this, but for the eligibility, the SBIR rules say that with the joint venture that each of the partners has to meet the SBIR size standard, the 500 employee size standard, or it allows for that mentor protege exception. So I don't know how much that's happening. If there are instances where under mentor protege agreements, those joint ventures are putting in proposals for SBIR phase 1 or 2, funding agreements. I don't know, but not something we really see much day to day in our work, but that is possible. Okay, next slide, please. We'll kind of push through these last few here. Let's see. Yeah, and this is just one of those things where these SBA rules as they relate to joint ventures, very important, not just for eligibility for the award itself, but once you're performing, you have to submit written certifications of compliance to the contracting officer. You have to submit written performance of work statements and contract in performance of work statements. And again, what happens when you're signing your name to something to the contracting officer? It's it could potentially put you in line for false claims, false statement, criminal liability, things like that. So these are very important You know, always have to give that caveat too. And these JV programs require these certificates of compliance, you know, when you're using them. Next slide. Okay, so, you know, I think the takeaway here, we'll kind of walk through real quickly these, you know, different requirements that have to be in the JV agreement. But they're generally, they are consistent across all the programs. So you'll generally find whether it's a small business JV between a protege and a mentor, whether it's an SDVOSB, woman-owned, 8A or HUBS-owned JV, these requirements are generally the same. Sometimes there's these little kind of gremlins in the rules that don't quite line up, but for the most part, these JV requirements are the same. So, you know, the thing I'll say on this point is be wary of that JV template you find on the internet somewhere when you're setting this up. That thing may be 6 years old and it may not comply with the rules as they're written today. And like I said, you know, the SBA looks very, you know, they're very particular about this. So if you don't have one of these items in your JV agreement and you get protested, you're going to lose the award. Because it has to read this way. It has to have these certain requirements. So what are they? So just FYI, when I say the SV, I mean like the woman-owned SDVOSB, 8A company, et cetera. So first of all, for the separate entity that we talk about, the separate LLC, that small business company needs to own at least 51% of the incorporated entity. So on paper, right, the 51% owner, the controlling owner is the small business. Here's what's different, and a lot of people don't kind of conflate the two, but profits are distributed commensurate with the work performed. So as opposed to commensurate with ownership, the rules require that profits and losses be distributed in accordance with work share. So that's something that's also required. Next slide. The joint venture agreement, it must itemize all the major equipment, facilities, other resources. It has to specify the responsibility of the parties. Sometimes the rules do say that if it's an IDIQ contract, so it's going to be less defined, obviously, if in that case, because you're not really going to know until the task order comes out. You can kind of adjust it and speak to that the best way you can. The rules do provide for that, but these are things that have to be in the JV agreement. The way we typically do this in our JV agreements is we set up an addendum or like an attachment to the JV agreement. And then every time you bid on a new contract, you would kind of adjust that attachment and re-execute it before. So you would kind of, tailor all these things with the specific contract. Next slide. Okay, this was asked earlier. So there's a work share requirement. So within the JV, the small business has to perform at least 40% of the work of the JV. So it's a minimum of 40% for the small business. And so the other partner, the non-SDVOSB small business or the large business mentor or what have you, can perform up to 60% of the joint venture's work. And that's calculated kind of in the same way that you calculate the limitational subcontracting rule, meaning $1 million comes into the JV, $400,000 goes to the protege, $600,000 goes to the mentor, less, things like materials and things like the limitational subcontracting rule specifies. The other piece is that the work performed by this way, it must be more than quote mere administrative function. So in other words, you can't just give them 40% of the revenue and all they're doing is maybe forwarding an email once with an invoice in it once a month or something. It has to be actual substantive work. Now, how does the SBA define that more than that? Not, particularly with a lot of detail, but just kind of that's a common sense rule. Like it has that small bit has to be performing substantive work in commit, with along with that 40% work share. All right, next slide. So just on that limitational subcontracting point, the JV itself, because these are set aside contracts, the JV itself has to also comply with the limitational subcontracting rule. So how does that work? Okay. You know, the contract, let's use the $1 million example. The JV wins the contract, it's $1 million. The JV has to, at the JV level, comply with the limitation on subcontracting work, meaning the JV can sub out, let's say if it's a services contract, it can sub out up to 50% of the work to a third party, non-similarly situated entity, right? So it can sub out 50%, let's say, to a large business. So you can do that, right? So now the JV is getting 500,000, third party subs getting 500,000. The JV performance of work applies to that 500,000 that the JV is getting. Does that kind of make sense? I know, I can't see head nods out in the audience, but I hope that kind of makes sense, right? That the JV is like this is the prime. So the JV has to comply with the limitation on subcontracting. And then within the JV has to then comply with the performance of work. And within the JV performance of work requirements, this may have been on the previous slide, the small business partner, they can't further subcontract out that 40%. They have to perform that 40%. And then this is another public service announcement. Quote 1099s, quote independent contractors, those are subcontractors for purposes of limitation on subcontracting and performance of work. They don't count as your own employees for that. So that's another public service announcement if you didn't hear anything else I said today. All right, next slide, please.
And Paul, yeah, we're gonna have to end the, at least a Zoom in person here, we can say.
Yeah, we're almost done. Yeah, we're almost done here. In fact, you go to the next slide, we're basically kind of done here. I think we already covered that. We already said that before. Again, you have these annual and post-contract reporting requirements. That's part of the roles as well. Next slide. We can skip over that part there. If the slides are being sent out, people can read that, so that's fine. Yeah, I mean, were there a few questions out in the audience? I mean, we're basically, I think, done there.
Okay.
There, last thing I'll say is there are several other JV agreement requirements. So things that say like the JV has to have a separate bank account. The administrative records has to be maintained by the small business, things like that. But just be mindful that that agreement has to comply with those rules. Yeah.
I don't have any in the chat, so I think I'm gonna end the Zoom, but we can say, especially if you guys have any questions, and I might ask them a couple questions. So with that, because we've got back-to-back events with this Zoom room, so
Okay,
that's
sure.
unfortunately why we've got to shut this one down. But thank you very much. Yes, I mean, you know how to reach out to Paul if you guys have specific questions, want to use the services, but thank you again for coming here. I know you're not feeling well.
Oh, it's all right. Yeah.
But we really appreciate it. I know